Okay, back with part two. In part one, I was talking about a lot of the interesting things in this book, which made me curious to check it out in the first place. In part two, I'd like to talk more about my reading experience. Now, again, this will contain some information about the book, but it'll also be a bit personal, talking about my personal reading experience, which who knows if that's of interest to anyone else, but I guess we'll see. So I had been, at the time I started this book, I had been in a book club with a few other friends out here in Saigon, here in Vietnam, where I'm currently living. And we'd been working our way through a number of the classics in this book club. Lady Chatterley's Lover, Passage to India, The Brothers Karamazov. So I had been angling for some time to get the book club to read Don Quixote, again because, as I mentioned in the first video, there were a number of things that sounded really cool about it based on the descriptions I had heard about it. But there was one guy in the book club who had tried to read it in the past. I think he had gotten all the way through part one and then had gotten bogged down in part two and just given up on Don Quixote at some point in the past. And he said, no, I'm not going through that again, not going to try and read Don Quixote again. Pick another book. It surprised me a bit because based on the description I had heard, part two sounded like the part where all the really interesting stuff was happening, where you have all this kind of meta-narrative about the characters commenting on the original Don Quixote. But part two, apparently, he was not able to finish. And in fact, there was another guy in the office who also had the exact same story. He had made it all the way through part one, couldn't finish part two. So I was already getting some preview that part two seemed to be where a lot of people were giving up for whatever reason. But this particular guy who was in our book club ended up leaving to go to a different country. And then as soon as he left, I said, okay, let's read Don Quixote. And the rest of the book club said, okay. I was really the only one who was pushing it, but everyone else went along with it. It was a group of about 4 or 5 other people. So, because we were living out here in Saigon, the versions that was available at the local bookstore was Words with Classics, which was readable but not great. They tend to go with whatever the cheapest edition was, and they've gone with the translation by Peter Motoyeks, published in 1700. I think because that was an edition that was in the public domain. The book itself, I think, was published first in 1605 and then 10 years later for part two in 1615 or somewhere around there. So it's not the most modern translation, but it is perfectly readable. I should emphasize that it's perfectly readable because if you're familiar with the classics, you know that a lot of them are a struggle to read. I think about a lot of the classics I had to read in college literature courses, or tried to read. Beowulf, Canterbury Tales, Paradise Lost, Dante's Inferno, Spenser's The Faerie Queen, and then that's without even getting into the modernists, James Joyce or Virginia Woolf or T.S. Eliot, or old Faulkner, all these books that are really difficult to figure out what in the world is going on. This is, for all its other faults, perfectly readable. The prose is a little bit old and stilted because it's it's from 1605 and this translation is from 1700, but it's perfectly understandable. I was never confused about what was happening. It plods along a little bit at paces. Plods along a little bit at places, but it's perfectly readable. So there's no reason to feel intimidated about the difficulty of the book. The length, though, might well intimidate you, and for good reason, because the prose can be a little bit plodding. And I don't know if a different translation would have brought new life to this. Again, I went with this because this was the only thing out in Vietnam. You know, somebody let me know if you've enjoyed a more modern translation that makes this a little bit more exciting to read. It's perfectly readable, it's just kind of stilted, old-fashioned prose. So, in the book club, we agreed to do part 1, and we had to push the date back a few times because we had trouble meeting the date. But I think we started in December 2018, and we ended up, December 2017, and we ended up finishing part 1 in February of 2018, after pushing it back a couple of times. Now, I've mentioned that the prose is a little bit stilted, and yet, in spite of that, it can be funny. It can be really funny, and the humor comes through well. And I mention that again because sometimes humor doesn't age well. You know, I think we've all had the experience of watching a sitcom from the 1950s, thinking, "But this isn't funny at all. It's so tame, and the jokes are so mild." And to a certain extent, humor does seem to change with generations. But then some stuff is timeless, and the humor does come through very well in this book. The principal gag, of course, is Don Quixote is mistaking things for something else. You know, he thinks the inn is a castle, he thinks the prostitutes are princesses, etc. And that's okay. You know, it gets a little bit old, but it's good for a little bit of a laugh. There's also humor derived out of how ridiculous Don Quixote is looking. But there's a lot more humor going on. There's humor based upon the people's reaction around what he's doing. So there's a scene where Don Quixote thinks that a herd of sheep is an army. So he's going to charge in to fight this army, and his squire or his sidekick Sancho realizes what's going on. And he starts yelling and screaming, "What are you doing? Open your eyes! Can't you see what's going on?" And he's pulling his beard and tearing his clothes, and he's just working himself up into such a fit because he can see the disaster that's coming. But, you know, you can scream and yell all you want. Once Don Quixote has started charging, you just can't reason with him anymore. He's totally in his fantasy world. And then he comes down and he's hacking away and slaughtering the sheep, and the shepherds are just standing there, not understanding what's going on, and not quite sure what to do about it. And so you can just picture, you know, the fact that Don Quixote himself has mistaken this herd of sheep for an army is really only a small part of the joke. The kind of reactions of everybody else around him is more where the joke comes in. And then, you know, eventually the shepherds kind of realize they've got to do something, and so they sling some stones at Don Quixote and hit him in the jaw and knock out some of his teeth. And then Sancho comes up to him, and Sancho says what Sancho always says after the disaster happens. "Why didn't you listen to me? I told you it wasn't an army. I told you it was a herd of sheep." Or, you know, "Why didn't you listen to me? I told you it was a windmill." And then Don Quixote will have this explanation about why he was right all along. He just refuses to give in to reality. He says, "Okay, well, now that I've kind of come to here, I can see that they're sheep, but it must have been an enchantress who switched the sheep in for the army at the last minute." And Sancho will have all these arguments with him, and Don Quixote will just refuse to admit he was in the wrong. And that kind of stubbornness is where more of the humor comes in. And also there can just be slapstick humor as well. And there's one scene where Don Quixote's in an inn, and he mistakes one of the women who works there, who also seems to be a sort of a prostitute, mistakes her for a princess, and this sets off a whole chain of reactions. because the man who had an arrangement to meet this woman later thinks Don Quixote is trying to move in on him. So he attacks Don Quixote, and then there's such a noise that the innkeeper comes up, and then the woman runs into Sancho Panza's bed, and Sancho Panza doesn't know why this woman's in his bed, so he starts hitting her, and then the innkeeper runs over there, and then they're all hitting each other in the dark, and then there's also a policeman in this inn who hears the commotion, and so then he runs in the dark trying to figure out what's going on. And then he runs into Don Quixote's room and said, what's going on? And Don Quixote says, well, why are you speaking to me so roughly? And then the policeman gets really angry at Don Quixote and hits him, and it's just this whole chain of reactions, which is another part of the humor in places. Even though this is a classic, it is not above scatological humor in places. There's Don Quixote wants to mix this healing potion, so he and Sancho drink this healing potion that Don Quixote has mixed from a recipe he remembers from a chivalric romance he read a long time ago. And it turns out, of course, to be absolutely terrible on their stomachs, and it causes them diarrhea, and it causes them to vomit. And it causes, at one point Don Quixote to vomit into the face of Sancho, and then Sancho vomits right back. And just a lot of gross bodily humor, but it works. It's funny picturing these scenes. I guess what I'm saying is this book can really be genuinely funny at times. These scenes can really come alive, and you can imagine it. And there is a lot, there's a lot of good humor to come in this book, and there's a lot of laughs to be had. Where it gets a bit of a slog to read through is partly just because it goes on and on and on and on, and that's even more true once you get to part 2. It's hard to work through, and it feels like it's never going to end. And again, that's even more true with part 2. And again, the stilted 1700s prose doesn't help. So it is a matter of kind of slogging through some of the slower parts, but then definitely being rewarded with a lot of funny moments. A question I always had before I started reading this book is, how can you get this many pages out of somebody fighting windmills or mistaking one thing for another thing? And the answer, well, there's a few different answers. One thing is that Don Quixote will sometimes encounter other people on his journeys. Kind of like, that old TV show, The Fugitive, right? Where it was the fugitive would travel from town to town, encountering other people and helping them with their problems. There are sections of Don Quixote that kind of take on that flavor, where he's traveling around and he's encountering other people and helping them with their problems. And that's one way the plot gets padded out a bit, is you've got all these other side stories coming into it. Now, of course, Don Quixote being Don Quixote, quite often he'll make the problem worse. Like, he'll attempt to help somebody, and then he'll just completely bungle it. And there's one scene where he encounters somebody earlier in the book. He tries to help him, and then later, near the end of part 1, that same character encounters him later. And that character said, you completely just made the whole situation worse. Please never ever help me again. And it's another funny moment where Don Quixote gets embarrassed in front of everyone and then tries to pass it off like he never did anything wrong. The other thing that's going on throughout this book is a satire of the chivalric romances, or those old stories about the legendary knights. And this satire comes out in any number of ways. Occasionally Don Quixote will be telling Sancho about these famous stories of knights. And Don Quixote will be relating the plot, and then Sancho will be asking questions about the plot. Kind of like, I don't know that. Have you ever seen that YouTube channel, Pitch Meetings, or something like that, where somebody is trying to explain the plot and somebody else is just pointing out all the holes in it? Or sometimes Don Quixote gets in conversations with other characters. Sometimes the other characters are trying to rile up Don Quixote by explaining the problematic parts of these old romances. Sometimes Don Quixote will try and act out what he's read in the romances about knights, and then that will just go to show how ridiculous these are. In many ways, it's just one long extended satire on these stories about heroic knights, which were quite popular in Cervantes' day. I'm reminded, actually, of another book I've reviewed on this channel, which is A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. And when I first read that book, I thought it was brilliant how Mark Twain was able to retell the legend of King Arthur's story, while at the same time making fun of the plot holes or the ridiculous conventions in these these stories about knights. But it turns out maybe I was praising Mark Twain too much, because Cervantes was essentially doing the exact same thing 250 years before Mark Twain. Now, there's a lot of references being made to works of knights, stories about knights that were popular back in Cervantes' day. Of course, King Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere and Merlin and all of those guys, you know, the classic Arthurian romance legend people, get referenced in here. But they're actually not the main legends that everyone's talking about. So it turns out, you know, if you go to Wikipedia or whatever, there's what they call the post-Arthurian romances. So this is, I guess, kind of after the legends of King Arthur had already been popular in the 12th centuries or whatever. These later legends about other knights started becoming popular in France and Spain. The big one was Amadis of Gaul. And that was the one that apparently was really popular in Spain in like the... I don't remember when. I guess roughly about the time Cervantes was writing, you know, the 16th or 15th century. And there are all sorts of references to Amadis of Gaul in here. And some of the sequels, you know, if you look up on Wikipedia, there was like 14 sequels to Amadis of Gaul, such as like Amadis of Greece. And that gets referenced in here. Sorry, am I pronouncing that right? Is it Amadis or Amandus? Sorry, it's a danger of doing this unscripted. You mess up the words. But it's in addition to that, there are all these passing references to all sorts of other legends and stories that were popular at the time. And I really had no idea about any of them. This Wordsworth edition does kind of footnotes them, but they don't really do a good job of the footnotes. It's not quite as thorough as you would wish. Of course, a book like this has so many references to other stuff. I'm not sure what the footnotes would ever look like if you tried to make them complete. But you know, there was references to like Roderick, the last king of the Visigoths, who apparently, you know, betrayed one of his nobles. And you don't get a lot of extra help from this in the book, but of course nowadays you can just go to Wikipedia and you look it up, and there is this interesting legend apparently about the last Visigoth king of Spain before the Moorish invasion. And apparently there's some sort of story similar to the rape of Lucretia, where he had raped one of the wives or the daughters of one of the noblemen, and then that led to the noblemen betraying the country to the Moors, betraying Spain to the Moors as a revenge. And Wikipedia says, you know, this story was for centuries regarded as historical fact, until relatively recently historians have come to question it. And it's that kind of thing, all these kind of legends and stories that I have no idea existed, but you get a bit of a flavor for it as you're reading through Don Quixote. It's almost like taking like a survey course in, you know, medieval romances that were popular at the time in Europe. And you know, like I'm never going to read a Modus of Gaul. I'm never going to actually track down these original classics that had influenced Cervantes and were apparently really popular at the time. But after having read this book, I feel like I have maybe a general idea of what's out there, even though I'm not going to read it. I felt like it was an interesting taste of stuff. Then, near the end of part 1, how am I doing on time here? Oh, okay, 10 more minutes. Sorry, the end of part 1, a bit of a more traditional plot does start to emerge. So Don Quixote and Sancho are out in the desert, and they begin to meet people. They meet this one guy who's out in the desert miserable because his true love married somebody else. And then they meet another guy out in the desert, a woman out in the desert who's miserable because she was supposed to marry this guy, but then he married somebody else. And it turns out this was the same guy that made the other guy miserable. And then Don Quixote's two friends, the barber and the curate, being a priest, I think, find him as well. And so now there's a little bit of a group traveling there. And we've got two people with plot issues that need to be resolved. And at this point, it begins to resemble more of a traditional plot. Now, for whatever reason, classic books love to resolve plots by coincidence. I mean, doesn't this seem like this happens all the time in Dumas and Dickens and all these books, right? Well, Cervantes is on that list. The whole thing gets resolved by coincidence when they're all at an inn, and then exactly the right people show up, and then actually more people show up, and it's like, oh, you're my long lost brother, and you know, it's just all such coincidence. But that's the way these books work to a certain extent, isn't it? What gets a little bit frustrating near the end of part 1. I mean, near the end of part 1, you do kind of feel like you've got more of a recognizable plot, and it stops being so episodic. But at the same time, they start inserting these stories within a story. So everybody's at the inn, and then the innkeeper says, oh, by the way, I've got this really interesting novel, why don't you read it? And then you spend 25 pages reading the story within a story, which, you know, I'm sure if you consult the critics, there's all this symbolism and multiple meanings and all this stuff. But me and the people in my book club found it to be a little bit of a slog. And then somebody else shows up at the inn, and people are like, okay, well, what's your backstory? And it's like, well, sit down, I will tell you my long backstory. And then that's, you know, another 25 pages. And again, as I mentioned in my earlier video, these are long, thick pages to get through. But then eventually the book does come to an end. And then we get to part 2. Now, part 2, as I mentioned before, was something I was really looking forward to reading because of the whole meta-narrative thing going on there. So I started part 2 with high expectations. But in my book club, we actually never finished part 2. We tried, we couldn't get through it. And I just had this book sitting on my shelf for months, and then a couple of years after that, and I eventually did finally work my way through it eventually. But part 2 can be a bit of a slog to get through. I mean, the thing is, I was talking before about all that interesting meta-narrative stuff going on, and it is there, but it's a small portion of the text, proportionally. By and large, it's just a return to Don Quixote out on the road again, mistaking one thing for another thing, you know, mistaking another castle inn for a castle, and etc. There is a difference, though, in that in part 2, he's recognized more. So, you know, people don't have to kind of realize, okay, he's a crazy knight. They just recognize him and they say, you're Don Quixote. I know exactly who you are. I've read your story. You're that crazy knight, aren't you? Which changes the story a bit. One of the things in part 2 is that people start deliberately messing with Don Quixote. So instead of like Don Quixote doing something crazy and everyone standing around being like, what's going on? Should we do something? Who is this crazy guy? In part 2, they actually contrive the situation. So Don Quixote in part 2, Don Quixote and his sidekick Sancho Panza end up at this castle of a duke and a duchess who have already read his story and want to get more classic Don Quixote humor. So they're manufacturing situations where like a maiden will come up and say, oh, Don Quixote, I've been enchanted. Can you help get me unenchanted? And trying to create all these heroic quests for Don Quixote to think he's going on just so they can get a good laugh out of it. Which is interesting to an extent. You know, it's something new and different from in part 1. And, you know, at first you're like, okay, well, let's see where this goes. But the problem is, it just goes on and on and on. There's just... And again, keep in mind, I'm just reviewing this from the perspective of a Philistine. Somebody who's only judging this based on the readability or how enjoyable it is to get through the book. Not somebody who's judging it on the literary quality or the symbolism or any of that. But just from my perspective, it does seem to go on and on and on and get really boring. Plus, something's a little bit lost here, because the fact that we know that these situations are being all manufactured means the reaction from the people around him is a little bit less interesting. That being said, there are some great comedic moments in part 2 as well. So, you know, you kind of take the slower parts with the higher parts. My absolute favorite... How much time do I have left? Okay, 3 minutes. Sorry, the clock's on the back of the camera. That's why I keep turning it around. My absolute favorite moment is they make Don Quixote believe that his one true love has been enchanted and turned into an old woman. And the only way to get this enchantment reversed is that his sidekick Sancho Panza has to whip himself 3,300 times on his butt, on his rear end. But the catch is he's got to do it willingly. So no one can force him to do it. Don Quixote can't just take the whip and do it for him. He's got to do it willingly. And so Sancho says... So that's established early on in part 2. Then throughout the whole rest of part 2... Don Quixote is constantly saying, Sancho, what are you doing? My one true love is enchanted. Why aren't you whipping your ass more? And Sancho's like, oh, I don't feel like it. I've just had a big dinner. I'll give myself a few good lashes on the butt tomorrow, I promise. And there's this constant thing throughout the rest of part 2 where Don Quixote is getting so frustrated that Sancho is not administering the whip to his buttocks. And Sancho really does not want to whip his own buttocks. So I thought that whole dynamic it's a running joke all throughout part 2 until it finally gets resolved. I thought that whole thing was just really funny, and there are these really funny moments in part 2, but it does also just go on and on and on. So quite frankly, this was a book that I had to force myself to finish, even though, having finished it, there's so many interesting and wonderful things I can talk about now. It was hard for me to force myself to finish this book, and it took me quite a while to finally get around to finishing it. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here. That is all I have left to say. Right on time. This camera's just about to shut itself down anyways. There's much more to say, of course. Were I inclined, I probably could make a third video, but that's all I'm going to say. So I'm going to shut it off here.